Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, and here today we are going to talk about some very interesting women, some mutinous women, as the story goes. And here we've got a trusty professor from University of Pennsylvania with a new book about these women who became, as she puts it, some of the founding mothers of Louisiana. Joan De Jean, thank you so much for coming on to the Ask Historians podcast.
Thank you, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be here.
So this is something I found really interesting. It's one of the first things you said in the book. We focus so much of our kind of American colonial attention on a particular coast, the Atlantic coast. I'm from Massachusetts, so all the stuff around Boston and Plymouth and on down. You talk about this second coast that we have, less well understood in a lot of Americans' mind, that also sees a lot of colonial activity, and that's the Gulf Coast. Can you just, I guess, explain what the colonial feel was down there? Is French colonies that we're talking about, and some of the, I guess, background history to the book that you've written?
Okay, that's a big one. Let me start with one piece. I realized early on that we're really fixated in this country, as you say, and I think everyone, on the East Coast settlement and on the English colonies, especially those first ones on the northern part of the East Coast. People sometimes think about California, so Spanish and another coast, but almost no one talks about the whole Gulf Coast, which was French territory, except for Florida, which was also Spanish. So a huge chunk. And when you say Louisiana, indeed, as you said, these women settled Louisiana, were among the first European women in Louisiana, but Louisiana was huge. It was the whole French territory. We think it's a state today, but it was numerous states today, all up the Mississippi as high as Illinois. It was essentially the Louisiana territory that was ceded to the United States what becomes the United States in the early 19th century. So this is a huge chunk of land, and but the first serious settlement is nearly a century after the East Coast, after the Mayflower, etc. And so in the very early 18th century, and French colonists begin this. They come over and settle this coast and occupy land. And so these women are there right at the beginning, the founding of a huge chunk of what becomes the United States. And I think it's because it's French and nobody pays that much attention. Spanish is part of our narrative. English is the core of our narrative, and French just sort of gets left out so often. And I think people have not paid much attention to it.
And this colony, as you describe, has a bit of a gold rush happening around the time that the book details. This is late teens into the early 20s of the 1700s. And in particular, there's a guy who seems to lead a lot of this. Why were people suddenly so interested in heading down to Louisiana?
Okay, well, it's the first problem. It's really the major problem that inspired this whole story. The French claimed a colony, laid claim to land that they named Louisiana in honor of Louis XIV in 1699. So they've been there for about nearly 20 years. Nobody had paid a lot of attention. They weren't very seriously interested. Every now and then someone would get slightly interested, but it didn't carry through. And then the Scots financier, he was apparently a brilliant financial theorist and a wild, crazy sort of guy, was given, Louis XIV dies, there's a regent who takes over in France because the next king is too young. And in those years, they decide they just give John Law control over the entire French economy. And he knows what's happening in English colonies, that the English colonies are quite wealthy because of tobacco. So he decides tobacco. We will build Louisiana on tobacco, and he promises them they will make a fortune from this tobacco. So everybody's on board. They're thrilled. Nobody asks if tobacco will grow on the Gulf Coast. That's no detail. There's no one there. They just decide it will work, and they're going to do it, and it will be hugely profitable. So he agrees to send slave ships. First time slavery is developed in the whole part of what becomes the Mississippi Valley, the Gulf Coast, and he needs colonists. Problem. So it's easier to get men. Getting women was a problem. So there in 1719 in Paris, he decides we have to have some women. And all of a sudden, they're not getting women will never sign up like that to go, unmarried women who would marry these colonists. So he just decides women will be arrested, or any woman. And people learn. One of the things that for me was most astounding was reading the files of prisoners in Paris, people arrested that year, and realizing that parents were willing to denounce their daughters to the police on the basis of almost nothing, and they would be locked up, shipped up, put in that boat, sent over. So some within weeks, some of them within days, found themselves on a boat, it was essentially a chain gang being sent through France to get to Le Havre, the port, for a boat, and then a couple of months later on a ship sailing across the ocean. And all because of finance and tobacco, which couldn't grow there, by the way.
That's where we get the title of the book, Mutinous Women, which you're tracking this particular ship where these women are on, and I do want to focus on this because this is kind of some of this that the stories you write about are remarkable. A lot of them are arrested for things like prostitution or various crimes that it doesn't seem like they maybe have a lot of evidence for, or trumped up charges. And can you just describe some of the ways in which they actually got women onto this ship? You mentioned that even family would denounce them.
In one case, one of the women who survived the journey and married quickly in the colony and is traceable in the colony, and today her descendants are all over. I know descendants of hers in Texas, New Jersey, etc. Anyway, her life begins in Paris. She had been training as an apprentice dressmaker. Her family would have paid, it was her sister and brother-in-law, would have paid a small sum of money for this. This happened often. She denounced the workplace, the workshop she was working in, as abusive, and she quit. They were mad because they would lose their money, their small sum of investment. They denounced her to the police as a libertine. Boom. She's gone. Other women worked, as I realized in this book, how vulnerable laundresses were. All these big households have a lot that needs to be washed. There's almost no home in Paris at the period has running water. So you send it all away, all your household linens, your table linens, your underwear, your clothing, you send it for washing. And people come to your house to pick it up. Anytime anything was missing in the household, the laundress stole it. And so they were really vulnerable because they know they have a routine, right? I learned from this. They would go into a room. People would leave the clothes on the bed. They'd pick them up, take them, bring them back, washed and ironed. And one of them got accused this way. She kept saying, absolutely no way. But that didn't matter. They had a charge. They were not investigating at this period. And the accusation stuck. They labeled prostitutes. Most of them were illiterate. So it's pretty hard. They can't even read the documents being written about them, and they can't, what do they do in these contexts? No one's going to defend them. And by the way, almost all of the police commissioners and high-ranking officers involved in these arrests were soon arrested themselves for corruption and put on trial. All of them were convicted. So these women were part of an enormous effort by truly corrupt police officers just to throw all the rules out the window and bring women in quickly.
So you mentioned part of this problem, which was that there were just a lot of men over there. One of the reasons why they're bringing over. I noticed you do mention at one point that there seems to have been some amount of concern that some of the men were I don't know what the term would be, intermarrying or with Native women, and there was some amount of concern around that. What was the relationship between men and the colonists and the Native American populations there in general, and specifically that issue, which seemed to have been a prime reason why they wanted to get French women over?
Okay, you were right about that. That's a huge question and a tricky one, Tyler. So I'm going to answer a tiny chunk of it, but the whole thing, we would spend the rest of this time on this. Basically, the French at this point do not yet have a firm policy against real marriage, even marriage officiated by a French priest between a Frenchman and a Native American woman. They develop this policy and then enforce it. But the women are coming just at the moment when they finally got enough men. They didn't have priests before to perform the marriages. This is the real beginning of a structure. And the priests who are there don't have paper and they don't have ink. So what's a ceremony if it's not recorded? And so we don't know very much about what precedes this. We just know that there's correspondence indicating concern about this development. And so the women are a handy way. Well, there weren't very many of them, but, it's just an attempt to change the situation.
You mentioned that they get, so there's this issue, they get railroaded into getting on this ship. This is a tough journey. And there are, I think about, you said 200 or so women on this.
Well, it gets winnowed down. There are about 200 on a list specified. I can't even tell you, the confusion was so enormous at every level. The police officer who was put in charge of this whole project was himself totally corrupt. He was convicted and imprisoned himself about a year after they landed. So he followed he wrote and asked that they relax the rules for him, which meant he had no rules. So he wrote some names down, some names he didn't. He just took women he didn't like. And the women who had talked back, who had asserted themselves when he questioned them, were not on the list. He grabbed them and put them on the list. So it's a real mess. In the end, about 132 women sailed for the colony under these relaxed rules. So, and what happened was, you were arrested. They were chained to each other at the waist in groups of 4. They were put into carts. They were paraded through the streets of Paris. And this was the treatment prostitutes got normally, were paraded to have a public humiliation. And they were driven in these carts through France to the coast.
Wow. And this is certainly not something, when you read about a lot of colonization efforts, or people going to various places with a sense of hope. I can't imagine that these women had that same feeling boarding that boat.
I can't even imagine what it was like. They had barely been fed. I know about one group, they were sent in groups, and one group got first to the coast. And this was the only time in this whole process that any officer of the French law, anyone in a legal capacity, took pity on them. There's a group in the prison there, and he said, but they're not even being fed. The French they were so bad about paying their bills. Everyone is investing in John Law's project, and nobody's doing day-to-day work. So the prison wasn't getting bread, which was the basic sustenance of every Frenchman at the period, because they hadn't paid the baker. So the women are not being fed. And so he wrote, and they said, oh, no one asked us for money. So there's no budget for them. So they just left them. So this man fed them from his own, he paid to get them food. And so we have a diet there. They were given a couple of ounces of vegetables and either a sardine or a bit of cheese every day. That was it. And that was then on the ship. French captains at the period once again had to request food in advance, and you got an authorization or not. Authorizations were not coming through. And I know from officers who traveled at the period that the captain would tell them, these men, just before sailing, go on shore and make sure you buy food. We don't have food for you. The ship sailed without enough food for the crew. So I'm betting they were barely fed during the weeks. And it was weeks. It was nearly a 2-month crossing of the crossing. So these women were treated. I mean, it was an incredible thing. I wondered how anyone survived all of this.
So once they get there, the expectation is that they are going to find a suitable husband, or a husband, I guess, any husband. How is it that gets facilitated, and how is it that they are supposed to then start making a life in this brand new, completely foreign, completely different place once they're off this ship?
You would assume that the plan would have been to send women and to encourage their marriage. However, they've been labeled prostitutes, criminals, and people just keep repeating that. At first, no one will even let them on shore. They spend weeks on an island, which is now off the coast of the state of Mississippi, where there is nothing. No tents, no food, no fresh water, no one. They just leave them there in February, which is not the warmest month in the Gulf of Mexico, and they leave them for a number of weeks. All of a sudden, people get, whenever they had complaints, so they rode them and left them on the mainland, on the beach of what is now Biloxi, Mississippi, and then they fended for themselves. Most of the officials in the colony didn't even know what happened to them. They just disappeared, and they did incredible things. Some of them traveled very quickly as far as Arkansas, the mountainous regions of Arkansas, which is not an easy journey to make over land at the period. Some of them arrived. New Orleans had just been founded at the period. It's a new capital, and it doesn't exist. I mean, there's nothing. There are a few shacks there. They arrive very quickly in New Orleans. They marry. I don't have traces of many of these marriages. They were probably not recorded. Right. We know that in many cases, what happened is they simply stood. Two people wanted to get married. They gathered some friends. They said, "We're married," and that was it. So they really clear land and found places like New Orleans, like Natchez, like Biloxi. So many cities that are cities today were literally built by these women and their husbands.
So that's actually, when you talk about some of the forgottenness, that's one thread that I'd really like to ask you about in terms of how you actually found researching this book. This is I take it a lot of reading between the lines and going back through histories to find things that people haven't necessarily unearthed before. How is it that you got onto this topic and got into this topic in terms of tracing these histories?
It was all really an accident. I've spent years now. I love the archives in a particular library in Paris, which are all the archives that were in the Bastille prison. In other words, all the archives of all the prisons in Paris. When they destroyed the Bastille, the revolutionaries were very careful. They preserved records. They didn't know what to do. They had all these archives. They figured, I'm sure they were right, that people would want to know someday about the horrible activities of the police under the monarchy. And so they kept all of these records. And the closest place to the Bastille prison, really right across the street today, a street that didn't exist then, is what's today a library. And it was about to open as the first public library in Paris. They'd gotten rid of its aristocratic owner, and they moved all the archives there. And for years, I've worked in those archives. And one day I was looking for someone with a last name beginning in F, and I came across this dossier and it had a woman's name on it, and underneath it someone had written, "and other female prisoners for Louisiana." And I grew up in the state of Louisiana, and I thought, wow, I wonder what this is. And I opened it up, and I was just in shock because these were stories. A lot of bits were in this one file, and these were stories I had never heard. I knew about the myth of prostitutes coming to Louisiana, which is what all the descendants have been told, that their ancestors were prostitutes. And when I started reading this, I started to discover stories like the ones I've been telling you about these women who were poor, very poor, illiterate working women in Paris who were arrested going about their daily lives.
And were these well documented? Were you able to find a lot of information? Because again, it seems like as you say, there's a popular narrative, if you even know about this kind of thing, which I'd imagine a lot of people outside of Louisiana don't.
Yeah, I bet.
And is it that has been ignored, or was it genuinely very difficult to learn a lot of this information?
I don't think anyone who hadn't been from Louisiana would have opened the file and started digging. And what it took was a lot of ability to cross-reference different archives in Paris. I've spent a lot of time, I've worked on things like book censorship, so authors who were condemned because they wrote works deemed too audacious, etc. And what I've had to do is learn who they were. And you have to go to other archives to trace their families or to see if they went on trial. They're completely different archives in a different place. And the first day I was doing this, I thought, maybe I'll go over there and see if I can come up with more. And I did, and I got call numbers that didn't make sense. And this is just crazy. I happened to run into the guy who was the former head of another archive, whom I knew. And I said, "What do you make of this?" He said, "Oh, if you move that around, that could make sense as the call number here." So it was just because I know archives and I know directors of archives, and I was able to dig. It took a lot. It was all there, a tremendous amount of information. It took a lot of digging between 4 very separate archives to put together. And I was incredibly lucky. Some of the key women were still there. I mean, in the case of the woman I traced most clearly from 1700 to 1734, a good chunk of her life, it was a miracle. She was an illiterate street vendor in Paris. Now, that her entire 2 trials for murders of which she was accused by totally ridiculous circumstantial evidence, when she had an alibi, no one looked into it, but that had survived. Her prison file had survived. And then her record, I can trace her in New Orleans until her will has survived. I mean, these are miracles. If you know the survival, the trials, I think I counted 31 trials covering 40 years of Paris's history. That's nothing, right? That's 0. And 2 of them are hers. I mean, that's just, it makes no sense, but there they were. But you might never have known. I remember when I saw those, I nearly fainted thinking, this is not possible. But I went through it in no time at all. It was her, indeed. So she has been recorded. People found the prison file, but they said she was a murderer. But if you read her trials, you knew that in the end, the people who testified against her, when they brought them into the room to confront the witness, they said, "Oh, we've never seen her before." So they had nothing, but they had a convenient person on whom to pin the charges, so they just locked her up.
And that's a common thread throughout all this that I do want to emphasize, that this was not something that you do mention. Is there were women who perhaps went over on different ships and in different circumstances,
yes,
and who also ended up marrying colonists, and who also ended up they had a bit of a different circumstance and experience than the women that you talk about here.
Oh, yes. On occasion, especially earlier to what is now Canada, what was New France at the period, and somewhat later, also to the Gulf Coast, there were ships in which women were sent over they were given, the passage was paid for, they were given a bit of money to help them start a new life, and they were sent over with supervision so that there was a nun accompanying, or nuns on the ship. But they had someone to interface to represent them with, these women were there with a crew.
Right.
Of sailors, a large crew of sailors. They detoured a slave ship from the trade between Africa and Martinique, the French islands in the Caribbean, to carry them over so they could chain these dangerous women in the hold of the ship. So they were completely at the mercy of anyone during the crossing. Other women traveled in other conditions, and later those women's stories have been found. Not all of them, by the way, because I came across some of them in the files, but I had 200 women to look for. That limited my activities. People would laugh at me who knew me because I would come with lists: arrested, shipped, survived, etc., and put my notes in different piles when I was going through. So there were different conditions. They have, however, benefited from no good conditions.
Right. And that kind of gets to an interesting, your book coming in at I think a very interesting time, and it's probably not a coincidence that it's happening, but there has been a lot in the past a few years, decade or so, examining the very complicated history of colonialism and colonialism here in the U.S., around the world. And the very complicated and the various viewpoints. And one of the things that I found very interesting about this is that, there's an indigenous viewpoint. There's the many people brought over as slaves from Africa. In some ways, these women are the colonists. They are the settlers. They are a part of this sort of oppressive colonial venture. And in other ways, they're very much at the whim of this system. And I was wondering, as you approach this topic, how do you approach a lot of that complicated backdrop of what was going on when it comes to telling the stories of these women and researching this venture?
That for me was the toughest. These were the toughest decisions because I couldn't tell the whole story. I was already over my word count with the story of the women.
Right.
So there was no way I could expand in all cases. What I tried to do was, when you talked about reading between the lines, I didn't feel I was reading between too many lines in their files. It was evident what was happening in the prison files in France.
Right.
I did in the colonies, for example. Sometimes it wasn't even that. I agree with you. I cannot imagine what it was like to feel they had gone from this position of being in chains, in prisons, very much the people who were not wanted, thrown onto the coast of this colony, and nobody cares about them. And then many of them marry well, some of them marry very well, and they move into positions. But on occasion, I could be sure of things. For example, one of the women married and lived in Natchez very early on, and was there when the Natchez Nation revolted against a man who was the commander of the outpost, the French post in Natchez, who was apparently totally corrupt and really did outrageous, tried to grab the land on which the Natchez Temple sat because it was prime land, and he wanted to build a house there. So the Natchez revolted and killed, as almost everyone at the settlement. Those they didn't kill, a number of women and children, were taken prisoner, taken hostage. Some of the women were killed. One of them was taken hostage. She had watched her husband and child be killed, but she was taken hostage. She was a captive for months. When this was all over, and the French were trying to, take reprisals. They'd have an army to try to kill, and they did more or less wipe out the Natchez Nation with this. But she stood up for them, and she said, no, some of the leaders they were captured and wanted to execute, and she said, no, they don't deserve it. So there was a sense in which she bonded, it's quite clear, with members of the leadership of the Natchez Nation against the French. So I think they had complicated positions in this, and sometimes they were quite open about it. It must have been virtually impossible because she couldn't have been open before a context like this. But when push came to shove and there was this attempted trial, she stood up for them, someone who had not been stood up for in France, a child of real poverty. So that for me was an incredibly telling story.
It's incredible, and it sort of, it also gets into some of the very tenuous nature of existence in this colony. You write a lot about a famine that happened, I think, around, what is it, 1721, 22
There were famines so
of course,
Tyler,
right.
that, you know.
And this is an area that's prone to flooding. This was an area with, as you say, very complicated relations with a lot of the Native American nations around, and to be thrown into it as they were. Can you just, whether it's one particular narrative or just a general overview, explain what do you do when you're, when you come, when these women sort of come to this society? How is it that they were able to gain any kind of foothold at the start?
Well, there were various ways. Some of them married soldiers and had therefore a relatively stable position. Some of those soldiers were, of course, killed. This happened. Many of them lost. One of them married 5 times because so all her husbands were soldiers and all of them were killed. But that at least allowed more or less a certain level of nourishment. Soldiers were fed before anyone else. So that was one way of doing it. A couple of them married officials in the colony. One of them married the man, François Hollande, married the man who was one of the storekeepers in New Orleans. In other words, he distributed food and clothing. So she married the source of everything people needed. So there were various ways, and there's like New Orleans is not particularly in this position, but all the smaller settlements, you had to live in complete harmony with your indigenous neighbors because you were dependent on them. They knew tobacco wouldn't grow, but they knew what would grow. They also had many of these French, they don't even send sufficient ammunition or arms for hunting. So everything was rationed, and the Native Americans have game. They also have the only thing from Louisiana that the French wanted in France, that is an export from Louisiana, that's fur. So they trade with them, and a number of the women married men who traded with indigenous peoples because they would give them French cloth, especially, and get furs, which they could then ship back to France. So they had a very complicated relation. One of them married it's just unbelievable, from a small town in central France where there's lots of river traffic, canal traffic, etc. She married a guy who traveled on all the bayous, etc., in a dugout canoe, a pirogue, and traded whatever there was. So people did, their relationships with the indigenous peoples were complicated and of necessity because to help the French survive so much in a time when their crops are being flooded out. There's nothing, they don't send the right crops to plant. They have no equipment. There were no plows. There was nothing. They don't even send them small boats And that's what you need if you're going to navigate rivers, etc. So they have nothing. They really were sort of just left there. And predictably, it did very poorly economically.
Right. And something that you've mentioned throughout a lot of this is just the territory, the landscape, the fact, obviously, tobacco, not the crop you want to be growing around there. You mentioned before we were recording, and you've mentioned in this, you were from Louisiana. You mentioned, obviously you've traveled around there, traveling there with friends as well. When you look at the landscapes now, and certainly anyone who goes down to Louisiana, I think people will immediately see the French influence down there, and we'll see all of the landscapes you talk about. Can you see both the French legacy and the legacy of that colony, even though now it is part of I guess an English colonial enterprise in the United States, and also can you still see a lot of those obstacles and those landscapes that they had to deal with back then?
Yeah, I think, well, there's two parts. Let's maybe talk about the French.
Yeah.
Continuing influence a bit. You see it very clearly. Anyone who's listening, if they've seen it, they're likely to have seen New Orleans.
Right.
That's the place most people see. And New Orleans, one of the things that is staggering is that what people call the French Quarter today, the old first section of the city built, and often built, I repeat, with the hands of these women. They cleared the land and built, because that's how land possession, they didn't have money, they didn't need it. If you cleared the land and built on it, it was yours in the first year or two. And so they were there and acquired this way. That remains very French. There's a lot of the influence that, streets are the same. The layout is essentially unchanged. So there's a real sense of their presence, I think, still in New Orleans. I even know where they lived. So I was able to go and see the houses on the lots today, but the lots are still there, which is pretty remarkable to think about. In 1720, they would have been clearing land. And here today, you can see the plot of land that was originally cleared by them. In many other places, there's not. Arkansas, you don't think of as French influence. Even a place like Mobile, which was a capital for a long time of the colony, nobody thinks of it. Whereas there was a huge French influence in Mobile, and many of them lived there. Alabama, Mississippi, most other places, I don't think have kept a sense of the French heritage to any real extent. But it was clearly there. Then they were there to a great extent. And what remains of the original landscape, of course, it's much changed. Anyone who reads the news knows that every hurricane takes a piece of that landscape away. But the central bayou landscape, etc., that's what they would have confronted, only more so. And that's still there. I can't even imagine what it would be like. There were rivers in France, of course, streams, whatever, but they weren't wild like this with the vegetation, and the swamp land, so much swamp land. This is what the French soldiers complained about so much, because they had to travel. Getting someplace, if there was a Native American uprising, just getting there was tough, because over land, you had to go through cane breaks, cross bayous, marshes. This was terrifically difficult terrain, and with flooding at times. The streets of New Orleans were only paved, the first ones, in 1821. So there was a whole century when they were living in mud. And it would have been just mud, so much of the landscape. And that was New Orleans that cleared. Whereas the bayou country, many of them lived in places that were along the river and along bayous. And water was their constant friend and enemy, I would think. And they lived in dugout canoes. They would have made so much of their life doing this. And that, I think, people today, even people who visited, and maybe they've taken a bayou trip,
Right.
the day. You don't see what they saw. Because
Right.
it has to. What today, they're fairly large boats that make those trips.
Right.
And they travel in large stretches of rivers and
Right.
bayous. To go into those things, I was lucky enough. I loved it when I was a kid. My paternal grandfather lived, and he had his own canoe, his dugout, and we would go every weekend, at least one day up in these bayous. So I know very well what that landscape is like, and it would not have been friendly looking to a French woman arriving there in 1719 from Paris, a lifelong Parisian. And there a few months later, if you're lucky, you have a dugout.
Wow.
And you're dealing with snakes of all kinds that you've never seen. Alligators terrified them because this was something impossible to imagine for someone from France. So it was at the same time French, in part because of them. They would have brought really the sounds and the textures and the clothing of Paris and the food with them, but wild.
Right. It's an incredible thought, and you actually mentioned this, which is something that I'm very interested in, because I interview people here who are Americans or English people studying Alexander the Great, or studying colonial Mexico or something. You grew up in this area. You, in some ways, this is a very personal history to you, and I was just wondering, as a historian, researching this and everything else that you've researched, how do you approach that on a very personal level? And out of sheer curiosity, were you able to trace any of these women to your family at all?
I will say, first of all, luckily, no. I was very glad. I worried a lot that I would have some personal link to it, and that I didn't feel entirely comfortable with. I love the fact that I have memories of the bayous, that I know them well, because that allowed me to sort of see through their eyes. I mean, I know I've worked on the history of Paris and the streets of Paris, so I could walk with them when they were accused of something or going to a house to pick up laundry. I knew just where it was, and I knew what they navigated in Louisiana. I didn't want to be personally involved. And I was lucky. So one day, though, I saw this name, because you read for a wedding. Legally, we still do. We have witnesses who stand up and say, "I know this person. They're etc." You call it a best man, perhaps in English today. And I see this name appearing, and I think, "Oh no!" And I realized that I have it. It's right over there. I could point to the closet with it. I had one day. One of my favorite aunt brought this thing to me. It was a little package in Saran wrap with crumbs of paper. And I read, and I see it was 18th century French. I said, "Oh no, I'm not opening this thing." So I brought it back to Philadelphia, and I gave it to someone who worked as a conservator at the Constitution Center, and I paid to have it put together. You'd never know it was in crumbs before. And it was a marriage contract by the first person in my mother's maternal family to come over, marrying the granddaughter of this man who had been a witness at the weddings of children of so many of these survivors. So I felt that I was linked. My family member had been a witness, and for me, it was that kind of link, just as a standby, saying, I know who they were.
Right.
The lies are not true.
Is the discomfort that you would have had having that personal connection, is that because you want to have a kind of an academic remove, or is it that you feel like a personal connection might color the way that you actually study it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's that you have to have a different voice then. And I didn't know, I thought a lot about this. You have to think with every project is different. How do you do it? How personal do you get? When I wrote about Paris, for me, that's personal too. I've lived off and on in Paris, except now, but from all my adult life. So the city was very much a character for me. But that's different. It's easy to be objective with a city and with women. I didn't want in any way people to be able to say, oh, she thought they were innocent because.
Mm.
She's a descendant of, she was, you look at evidence, you have to look at evidence differently if you're a direct descendant of one of the people on trial. And that would have slightly bothered me. But so I can say with a whole conviction that no, I'm not a descendant. However, my biggest motivation, and it was a long slog, there were years of digging, and it's not always fun. Some of this is just the record books of the police, all the arrests in Paris every year. That takes, you spend a lot of time just going through them. But all the time I kept thinking, suppose you were a descendant. And we know they have so many, I know now, there's so many descendants still alive. Don't they deserve to know who their ancestor was and what her life was in France? What she was accused of, what she was guilty of. One woman was guilty, by the way. I can tell you this. They accused her of, she was a laundress. They accused her of theft. She kept saying, no, no, no. She said, but I do admit that one day I went into like the equivalent of a small restaurant, and she ordered a plate of beef stew cooked with wine. She gave the name of the dish and a glass of red wine, and she snuck out without paying because she said, I didn't have a cent to my name.
Wow.
So that was her crime. But otherwise they were not guilty. And I wanted descendants, they deserve to know this.
Right.
The information is available. And I felt that I have no idea how many there still are, but there are lots, because not many, how could people have found out about me? It would be by accident. And yet numbers of groups of descendants have contacted me from all around the country.
And that kind of gets into I don't mean this in a combative way, but one of the big questions I like to ask always is sort of why should we be concerned about this particular history, which I think is one of these histories that doesn't get told often enough, and maybe that's it in and of itself, that this is a different viewpoint to look at the history of colonization in the U.S. and on the Gulf Coast. But why is it that you think this is so important to tell this story?
Well, I think for me it was very unusual, and I don't think it can be done. For example, for the very early English colonies, just survival of records, accidents of fate, to know exactly who a group of colonists were, where they came from, what they had done, what their lives were in France, what they had done, etc. To be able to collect that much information is in and of itself of importance, because we can't trace groups like this very often. Also, for me, it was the access to the lives of very ordinary people. That's something. I mean, the story is too often told from the point of view of military leaders or political leaders or people with certain, generally men, and people with status, education and status, who have been able to contribute to the record. And in this case, as I said, massively they were illiterate. Not all of them. A few of them were even from well-placed families, well-connected. One of them was from high nobility. So it's a varied group, but the majority were working-class Parisian women. And I had never had access to this. I'd never thought about laundresses. Laundresses became a huge preoccupation for me because so many women, it was a profession, you didn't have to have training, and it was something that was needed. So they did it. So it was these ordinary lives to see. I learned how laundresses worked. What people left you a key. If you were just like a single guy, you'd leave a key. The laundress would go in and take your laundry and then put it back. So all kinds of things about the daily life of a city, and then the daily life of women in a place across the ocean. So that for me was interesting, because I don't think you have history told too often from a female viewpoint. So that you asked me initially, what did I do? I decided I could only tell one story. And I did try to give the larger picture whenever I could. And I chose certain events to represent that larger picture, but I tried to keep to the women's point of view, what they lived, where they lived. So I tried to go place by place and put the women into the place, these the surviving women from this deportation, as it was called, campaign, and really tell the story from their point of view. So I think it's the viewing angle is completely different, both on Paris and on the colony.
It's a really interesting story, and again, a really interesting viewpoint that I think most people don't. It's not even that they don't necessarily know it. They probably haven't thought of it. they probably don't even know they don't know it. I would highly recommend everybody listening that the book is called Mutinous Women: How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast. And thank you so much, Joan De Jean, the author, for coming on the Ask Historians podcast and talking about this fascinating story.
Thanks a lot for your questions, Tyler. I really appreciated them.
I'm Tyler Alderson. You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast, and you can tune in for the next episode in a couple of weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.